Where are you reading this now? Perhaps you are in a bustling city, surrounded by the hum of modern life, the glow of screens, and the constant rush of traffic outside your window. Or maybe you find yourself in a quiet suburb, the silence of the night broken only by the distant bark of a dog. You could be anywhere, in any country, in any time zone. The specifics of your location do not truly matter. What matters is that a story like this, a story of isolation and the slow fracturing of the mind, can reach you wherever you are. It crosses oceans and decades, a ghostly whisper from a time long past, reminding us that some fears are universal and timeless. My work has often led me down the shadowed corridors of history, specifically into the opulent, yet often suffocating world of the Gilded Age. I have always been drawn to tales that lurk behind the grand facades of wealth, stories of families bound by secrets and expectations. These are not tales of ghosts in the traditional sense, but of the phantoms that haunt the human psyche. They are stories of immense fortunes that purchase not happiness, but a profound and inescapable isolation. The mystery of Greyhore Estate is perhaps the most unsettling of them all. A perfect storm of money, seclusion, and a dangerous new curiosity about the hidden depths of the human mind. The Vantmore family's ordeal is a chilling example of this phenomenon. It serves as a stark reminder that the most terrifying spaces are not always dark cellars or forgotten attics, but the vast, uncharted territories within our own consciousness. The events that transpired during the winter of 1904 on the remote coast of Maine were not born of malice or supernatural forces. Instead, they grew from a seed of intellectual fascination, nurtured in an environment of profound loneliness and grief. This is what makes their story so compelling and so deeply disturbing. It feels as though it could happen to anyone, given the right, or rather the wrong, set of circumstances. As we delve into the carefully preserved documents left behind by those who lived through that dreadful winter, we are not merely observers of a historical curiosity. We become participants in their growing unease. The letters and diary entries serve as a bridge, connecting our modern understanding of psychology with their nascent, fumbling explorations. We feel the biting wind off the Atlantic. We hear the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, and we sense the slow, creeping dread that began to permeate the very walls of Greyhore Estate. This is the power of a well-documented tragedy. It makes the past breathe again. Greyhore Estate was not built to be a home. It was constructed as a declaration. Perched precariously on a desolate stretch of the Maine coastline, it was a monument to the immense wealth of its creator, the industrialist Cornelius Vantmore. From a distance, it appeared as a chaotic jumble of architectural styles, a Frankenstein's monster of a mansion. It boasted Gothic spires that clawed at the perpetually gray sky, Palladian windows that stared out like vacant eyes at the churning Atlantic, and stern Tudor gables that seemed to frown down upon the windswept landscape. The estate was a testament to Gilded Age excess, a place where money could buy anything except, it seemed, a sense of belonging or peace. The isolation of Greyhore was absolute, a feature that Cornelius had deliberately engineered. The nearest town was a grueling hour-long carriage ride away, a journey made treacherous and often impossible by the brutal coastal winters. The estate was its own self-contained world, a kingdom ruled by the whims of its master, cut off from the society he both courted and despised. The grounds were vast and meticulously manicured in the summer, but in winter they became a frozen wasteland. The formal gardens, with their stone cherubs and intricate boxwood hedges, lay buried under thick blankets of snow, their beauty rendered sterile and alien by the unyielding cold that swept in from the sea. Inside, the mansion was a labyrinth of cavernous rooms, each more opulent and overwhelming than the last. Dark, polished wood paneling covered the walls, swallowing the weak winter light that struggled to penetrate the heavy velvet curtains. Immense tapestries depicting grim historical battles hung in the grand hall, their woven figures seeming to writhe and shift in the flickering gaslight. The air was always still and heavy, thick with the scent of beeswax, wood smoke, and a faint, indefinable hint of decay, as if the house itself were slowly suffocating under the weight of its own grandeur. It was a place designed to impress, but it succeeded only in intimidating and unnerving all who entered. The sounds of Greyhore were as unsettling as its appearance. The constant, mournful howl of the wind as it battered the windows was a relentless companion. The house groaned and settled around its inhabitants, a symphony of creaks, sighs, and inexplicable rattles that echoed through the long, empty corridors. The ticking of dozens of ornate clocks, each set to a slightly different time, created a discordant rhythm that seemed to measure out not the passing of hours, but the slow erosion of sanity. It was within this gilded cage, this magnificent and oppressive fortress, that the Vantmore family would find themselves trapped by fate and the final wishes of a dead man. The winter of 1904 began with a sudden and profound shock for the Vantmore family. Cornelius Vantmore, the patriarch and architect of their fortune, was struck down by a heart ailment in early November. His death was as abrupt and commanding as his life had been. One moment, he was a towering figure of industry, his influence felt from Wall Street to the halls of Washington. The next, he was gone, leaving behind a silence that was somehow more imposing than his booming voice had ever been. His passing left his family not only bereaved, but also adrift, their futures suddenly and strangely uncertain, tethered to the whims of his final testament. The reading of Cornelius's last will and testament was an event shrouded in tense formality. Gathered in the cavernous library of Greyhore, his family listened as the lawyer's dry voice spelled out their fate. The will was unconventional, even eccentric, a final exertion of control from beyond the grave. Cornelius, ever distrustful of the world and even his own kin, had decreed that his vast fortune would not be immediately divided. Instead, his two daughters, Parthenia and Sophronia, and his younger brother, Maximilian, were required to reside together at Greyhore Estate for a period of 1 full year. Only after this period of mandatory cohabitation would the inheritance be dispersed. This peculiar stipulation was a source of immediate and palpable tension. The three relatives were virtual strangers to one another, their lives having diverged significantly over the years. They were now bound not by familial affection, but by a legal document and the shared, isolating space of the mansion. The will stipulated that if any of them left the estate for more than 24 hours before the year was complete, they would forfeit their entire share of the inheritance. Cornelius had, in effect, created a prison of his own design, forcing his heirs into a state of gilded captivity, with the promise of immense wealth as both the bait and the bars of the cage. The staff of Greyhore, from the stern housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, to the young footmen and maids, were also included in this strange arrangement. Their continued employment was guaranteed for the duration of the year, their salaries paid from the estate's coffers. They were to continue their duties as if the master were still alive, maintaining the house's impeccable yet sterile order. This created a bizarre dynamic, turning the servants into both wardens and fellow prisoners. They were tasked with observing the family, ensuring the terms of the will were met, while being just as trapped by the estate's isolation and the oppressive atmosphere that began to settle over it like a thick winter fog. The three principal figures trapped by Cornelius's will were a study in contrasts, each bringing their own private griefs and anxieties into the suffocating confines of Greyhore. The elder daughter, Parthenia Vantmore, was a woman in her late 20s, already settling into the quiet resignation of spinsterhood. Practical and deeply conventional, she saw her duty as upholding the family's dignity and managing the household. She was the anchor, attempting to impose a sense of normalcy on their bizarre situation. Her days were spent overseeing the staff, planning menus, and writing letters, her actions a constant, desperate battle against the encroaching chaos and the profound sense of purposelessness that haunted the mansion's halls. Her younger sister, Sophronia, was a far more fragile and ethereal creature. Barely out of her teens, she was possessed of a nervous, artistic temperament. Before her father's death, she had dreamt of studying music in Vienna, a dream now indefinitely postponed. The oppressive silence and gothic gloom of Greyhore weighed heavily on her spirit. She spent most of her time in the music room, her fingers drifting listlessly over the keys of the grand piano, producing melancholic, half-finished melodies that seemed to be absorbed by the heavy draperies. Sophronia was a bird in a cage, her youthful vitality slowly draining away in the face of her enforced confinement and the bleak, unending winter landscape outside. The most enigmatic member of the trio was Maximilian Vantmore, Cornelius's younger brother. A man in his early 50s, Maximilian was the family's intellectual black sheep, a gentleman of leisure who had never shown any interest in the family business. He was an amateur scientist, his mind a whirlwind of the latest, most radical theories of the age. He saw the year of confinement not as a prison, but as an unprecedented opportunity. With an entire wing of the mansion at his disposal and an unlimited budget from the estate, he could finally pursue his obsessive interests without distraction. He was a man possessed by a dangerous and boundless curiosity, particularly concerning the new and controversial science of psychology. Rounding out this strange household was the staff, led by the formidable Mrs. Gable. She had served the Vantmore family for decades and ran Greyhore with an iron fist and an unyielding adherence to routine. She and the other servants, the stoic butler, Mr. Davies, the skittish maids, and the young, impressionable footman, were the silent observers of the unfolding drama. They moved through the grand rooms like ghosts, polishing silver, tending fires, and serving meals in near-complete silence. Their presence was a constant, watchful backdrop to the family's isolation, their loyalty torn between the memory of their late master and the increasingly strange behavior of the living inhabitants they were now forced to serve and scrutinize. Our clearest window into the events of that winter comes not from second-hand accounts or later recollections, but from the documents the residents themselves left behind. A collection of diaries, letters, and scientific notes, now known as the Vantmore Archives, was discovered decades later, tucked away in a locked secretary desk in the mansion's library. These papers form a chillingly intimate and methodical record of a collective descent. They allow us to reconstruct the timeline of events with unnerving precision, tracking the subtle shifts in mood and perception as the isolation and Maximilian's experiments began to take their toll on the inhabitants of Greyhore Estate. Parthenia Vantmore's diary provides the central narrative thread. Written in a neat, controlled hand, her entries begin as a straightforward chronicle of household management. She notes the weather, details meal plans, and records her frustrations with the terms of the will. An early entry from December 1903 reads, "The snow continues unabated. We have not seen the road for a week. Sophronia is listless, and Maximilian remains sequestered in the east wing with his books and strange devices. The silence of this house is a physical weight. Her writing is our anchor to reality, the voice of reason attempting to make sense of the growing strangeness around her." In contrast, the letters of Sophronia to a friend in Boston, which were never sent, offer a more emotional and fragmented perspective. Her elegant script becomes increasingly erratic as the winter progresses. In one unsent letter, she writes, "Dearest Clara, I feel as though I am living in a dream. The days bleed into one another, marked only by the changing light upon the snow. Uncle Maximilian speaks of the most peculiar things, of thoughts that can be measured and memories that can be reshaped. Sometimes, when I am playing the piano, I feel as though the music is not my own. It is a terrifying sensation, as if another person is thinking inside my head." The most disturbing documents, however, are Maximilian's scientific journals, filled with meticulous, dispassionate observations. They read like a laboratory log. He details his readings of new psychological theorists like William James and Pierre Janet, and he outlines his own hypotheses on suggestion, memory, and perception. He writes of his subjects, referring to his nieces and the staff with a chilling detachment, documenting their moods, their slips of the tongue, and their dreams as if they were mere data points. An entry from January 1904 coldly states, "Subject S, Sophronia, exhibits heightened suggestibility, particularly after prolonged exposure to metronomic auditory stimuli. Commencing Phase 2 of the perception experiments tomorrow." These papers, taken together, form a polyphonic account of a psychological implosion. The initial weeks of the confinement at Greyhore were marked by a rigid, almost suffocating routine. Parthenia, in her efforts to maintain a semblance of normalcy, insisted upon a strict schedule. Breakfast was served at precisely 8, followed by a silent, lonely morning. Luncheon was at 1, after which the inhabitants would retreat to their separate corners of the vast mansion. Dinner, the most formal and trying affair of the day, was a tense gathering in the cavernous dining room, where the clinking of cutlery and the ticking of the grand clock were often the only sounds. This relentless structure was a fragile dam built against the rising tide of boredom and simmering resentment. The isolation was a palpable force, pressing in on them from all sides. The relentless snowstorms of that Maine winter served to physically sever them from the outside world, turning Greyhore into an island in a sea of white. Newspapers and mail arrived infrequently, and when they did, the news they carried seemed to belong to another, impossibly distant reality. The family members, already strangers, grew even more distant from one another. They would pass in the long, shadowy hallways with a polite nod, their conversations limited to brief, meaningless pleasantries about the weather or the quality of the evening meal, each locked within their own private world of grief, boredom, or obsessive study. Subtle tensions began to fray the edges of their forced civility. Parthenia grew increasingly irritated by what she perceived as Sophronia's languid melancholy and Maximilian's selfish withdrawal into his work. She saw their behavior as a failure to uphold the family's dignity in the face of their strange predicament. Sophronia, in turn, felt suffocated by Parthenia's rigid control and unnerved by her uncle's intense, analytical gaze. She often complained of headaches and a sense of being perpetually watched, a feeling that Parthenia dismissed as youthful hysterics born of boredom and an overactive imagination. The servants, too, felt the strain, their hushed conversations in the kitchen filled with speculation and unease. Maximilian, meanwhile, was utterly oblivious to these simmering interpersonal conflicts. He was a man energized, thriving in the seclusion that so oppressed the others. He spent his days and nights devouring books on the nascent fields of psychoanalysis and experimental psychology, his mind alight with radical new ideas about the subconscious. He ordered strange equipment from Boston and Europe, galvanometers, chronoscopes, and intricate brass devices for measuring reaction times. To Parthenia and Sophronia, the East Wing, where he had established his laboratory, became a place of mystery and vague apprehension, the source of odd humming noises and strange rhythmic clicks that sometimes echoed through the house in the dead of night. Maximilian Vantmore's fascination was not with the occult or the supernatural, but with something he considered far more powerful and mysterious, the mechanics of the human mind. He was captivated by the emerging belief that the inner world of thoughts, emotions, and memories was not an unknowable spiritual realm, but a physical system that could be observed, measured, and even manipulated. He saw his nieces and the household staff not as family or employees, but as a perfect isolated sample group for his amateur investigations. His goal, as stated in his journals, was to chart the unseen currents of the psyche and prove that reality was far more subjective than anyone believed. His experiments began subtly, woven into the fabric of daily life at Greyhore. He would engage Sophronia in long, meandering conversations, carefully noting her responses to certain trigger words and concepts. He introduced a large, swinging metronome into the parlor, claiming its steady rhythm was soothing to the nerves, while secretly documenting its hypnotic effect on the household. He would ask seemingly innocent questions at the dinner table about dreams and forgotten memories, his eyes gleaming with scientific curiosity as he listened to the answers. He saw himself as a pioneer, a trailblazer on the frontier of a new science, and this belief absolved him of any ethical concerns. The experiments grew more elaborate and intrusive as the winter deepened. Maximilian began using more sophisticated apparatus. He would invite a skittish housemaid into his laboratory under the pretense of needing assistance, only to attach electrodes to her fingers to measure her galvanic skin response while he read her unsettling passages from Gothic novels. He convinced Sophronia to participate in memory exercises, where she would stare at a spinning patterned disc designed to induce a mild trance state, after which he would question her about her earliest childhood recollections, subtly suggesting details and observing whether she would incorporate them into her own memory. To the others, particularly Parthenia, Maximilian's activities were simply the eccentric hobbies of a reclusive intellectual. She saw the strange devices and odd questions as harmless, if annoying, diversions. She was too preoccupied with the practicalities of running the estate and enforcing the terms of the will to pay close attention to the true nature of her uncle's research. She did not understand that he was not merely passing the time. He was actively experimenting on the minds of those around him. He was planting seeds of suggestion, blurring the lines between memory and fantasy, and methodically documenting the slow, quiet unraveling that his own scientific curiosity had set in motion. The methodical application of Maximilian's psychological theories began to have a tangible, deeply unsettling effect on the atmosphere of Greyhore Estate. Reality, once a solid and dependable foundation, started to feel fluid and uncertain. The change was not sudden or dramatic, but a slow, creeping alteration of perception that affected nearly everyone in the house. It began with small, inexplicable occurrences. A servant would misremember a simple instruction given only moments before. Sophronia would become convinced she had had a particular conversation with Parthenia, who would insist with genuine frustration that no such discussion had ever taken place. These were minor fissures, but they were spreading. Sophronia was the most profoundly affected. Her already delicate disposition made her highly susceptible to her uncle's suggestions. She began to experience vivid, disturbing dreams that she felt were not her own, filled with places she had never seen and people she had never met. During the day, she suffered from moments of dissociation, feeling as though she were watching herself from a distance. In her unsent letters, she described a terrifying incident where she looked at her own reflection in a mirror and, for a fleeting moment, did not recognize the face staring back at her. The music she played grew more discordant, reflecting the growing chaos in her mind. The psychological disturbance was not limited to the Vantmore sisters. The staff, subjected to Maximilian's passive experiments and living under the constant low-level stress of the environment, began to show signs of strain. The young footman, James, became obsessed with the idea that the portraits in the gallery were watching him, their eyes following him as he went about his duties. Mrs. Gable, the stoic housekeeper, was found one evening standing motionless in the main hall, unable to remember why she had entered the room or where she was going. These were not signs of madness, but of minds stretched to their breaking point by isolation, suggestion, and a pervasive sense of unease. Even Parthenia, the pragmatic and rational anchor of the household, began to doubt her own senses. Her diary entries, once so clear and decisive, became tinged with uncertainty. She wrote of hearing faint whispers in empty rooms and catching fleeting movements at the edge of her vision. She meticulously logged these lapses in perception, attempting to find a logical explanation, but finding none. "I must be overtired," she wrote in one entry. "This house plays tricks on the mind." And yet the feeling that something is fundamentally wrong, that the very air is thick with confusion, is impossible to shake. The orderly world she had fought so hard to maintain was dissolving from within. What makes the case of Greyhore Estate so profoundly chilling is not a climactic act of violence or a supernatural revelation. No ghosts were ever found, no bodies discovered in the walls. The horror of the story lies in its cold, clinical precision. The Vantmore archives provide a step-by-step, meticulously documented account of a collective psychological collapse. It is a story about the fragility of the human mind and the terrifying ease with which the boundaries of reality can be warped, not by specters, but by science and suggestion. The descent into chaos was not a wild, screaming plunge. It was an orderly, measured, and carefully recorded process. Maximilian's journals are the most disturbing testament to this. He never saw the distress he was causing as a human tragedy, but as a successful experiment. He logged Sophronia's growing dissociation and the staff's confusion with the same dispassionate interest a botanist might record the wilting of a plant under controlled conditions. His final entries speak not of remorse, but of triumph. He believed he had proven his hypothesis, that the psyche was malleable, that memory could be sculpted, and that perception was merely a suggestion. He was a man so blinded by his intellectual quest that he failed to see the human cost of his discoveries. When the year of confinement finally ended, in the winter of 1904, and the lawyer returned to Greyhore, he found a household transformed. He found Parthenia, her hair prematurely gray, clutching a diary filled with obsessive, looping notes about auditory and visual anomalies. He found Sophronia in the music room, pale and vacant, playing a single, dissonant chord over and over again, unable to hold a coherent conversation. And he found Maximilian in his laboratory, surrounded by his charts and graphs, eager to present the findings of his year-long study into the systematic unraveling of the minds of his own family. The staff were hollow-eyed and jumpy, eager to flee the oppressive atmosphere of the house. The legacy of Greyhore Estate is not one of horror, but of a deep and abiding unease. It reminds us that the greatest enigmas are not hidden in haunted houses, but within the 3 pounds of matter inside our own skulls. The story is a stark, Gilded Age parable about the dangers of unchecked curiosity and the terrifying potential for a carefully constructed reality to simply fall apart. The precision of the documentation, the cold, scientific language used to describe the erosion of sanity, is what stays with you. It suggests that the most frightening thing in the world is not a monster in the dark, but the quiet, methodical process of the mind turning against itself.